Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to The Quality Hub, chatting with ISO experts. I'm your host, Xavier Francis, and today I'm here with Brian Smith, Director of Consulting Services. So glad to have you here with us today.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. So this week's podcast is the first in a two-part series called ISO 9001 Risk-Based Thinking, and the first part will be about how to apply it. But before we dig into that, let's first learn a little bit about our guest. Now, Brian, I know you've been on many times, so let's start with an odd question. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Probably to travel back in time.
Back in time? You'd be a time traveler?
I'm really into history.
That's cool.
And I'd love to go back and meet some of these people and see how they really were.
I'm not quite sure what I would want to have as far as a superpower, but going back in time does sound interesting. Well, that was fun. Let's dive into our first question. How does risk-based thinking integrate into the ISO 9001 framework?
Let's start with the fact that the ISO 9001 standard changed drastically in the 2015 edition.
Okay, how so?
Well, up until, all the versions up until the latest one, 2015, risk-based thinking was implied. It was through requirements for planning, review and improvement, but it was prescriptive. And that's an important point to make. The thing I like about the new way they're doing it is it gives you, as your organization, a lot more leeway to adjust your activities and your controls to the level of risk that you see.
Okay.
Where in the last versions before this, you actually had to have a written procedure for preventive action.
Okay.
As well as a written procedure for corrective action.
Right.
Now you don't need any written procedures, which I love that too. Mm-hmm. But like I said, you had to have a written procedure for preventive action. Now, in the 2015 edition, those words do not appear.
Okay.
And, really? Well, now the entire standard is preventive action.
Okay.
And it's less prescriptive and more open to, you want to mitigate risk and leverage opportunities, govern yourself accordingly.
Right.
I like that, right?
Right. So really, it's almost the whole basis for the standard now. Preventive action is a form of risk-based thinking. You're thinking about it. You're preventing things from happening.
Yeah, exactly. And, the whole point of your QMS should be a preventive tool. Obviously, we can't see everything coming. That's why we have corrective actions and issues. Right. But if you set out to identify this stuff ahead of time, that is risk-based thinking.
Right.
And now the 9001 standard is conducive with that. And I've said this to a lot of my clients. The 2015 edition, the 9001 standard became a tool instead of a burden. And if you're missing one of the requirements, you're probably losing money.
Okay. In
the 2015 standard, the risk-based approach starts in the very first auditable clause, 4.1.
Okay.
And it requires you to identify your context of your organization. Mm-hmm. And that's an abstract term. But basically, you need to identify issues that could potentially cause risk to your organization's ability to consistently achieve the intended results.
So before it wasn't there, now it's one of the first things you got to do.
Right there. Yep, right there. With risk, you also want to look at opportunity.
Right.
You want to have your eyes out ahead to look for risks, but also for something that provides opportunity.
Right. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later too. So let's look at the tools that you see that are commonly used when you're looking at risk-based thinking.
There's lots of tools out there. There has been for a long time. And again, you want to tailor it for your need. So when the new standard came out, here at Core, we created a very simple table in Microsoft Word that documented the various issues and the risks they potentially posed and the action we needed to mitigate them. That was a very simple table. It met the minimum requirements of the standard when it was new, but as time passed, we developed a more detailed matrix that involves a scoring system to help prioritize the risk by analyzing severity of impact and the likelihood of the risk being realized.
All right.
So it also introduced opportunities to the discussion. And as I said before, context issues can provide opportunities as well as risks. That's been a popular approach for our customers. It's pretty simple.
Now, what is that called?
That's called the Improvement Plan.
Improvement Plan, yep. And that is available to our core customers.
Yes. And it's in the document library.
The document library, thank you.
We do have some customers that have been doing detailed risk management before we got there.
Mm-hmm.
So they're meeting 4.1
Right.
and 6.1, 6.2 down the line with what they're doing. And, one of my customers uses a SWOT.
Right.
They were using it when I got there. And that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Mm-hmm.
That pretty much sums up risks and opportunities, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
There's others, but those three are pretty common. We'll talk about a couple more later on.
Well, I know we're looking at metrics and stuff like that
Yeah.
next week, so we probably can touch on some of that.
Yeah.
So really, like what we've talked about before, you take credit for what you've done. If you're not doing something now, it'd be great to use the improvement plan. But if you are doing something and you're looking at your strengths and weaknesses, it's one of those tools. Just apply it to ISO and take credit for what you're already doing.
Yeah, you want to. That's right. Well, that's what our consultants do in the beginning of a project. They're gonna look at what you have going on, and if you're meeting the standard with your current activities and you like your current activities, we're gonna leave it alone.
Yeah. Take credit for what you're already doing. You mentioned we were in 4.1. Is context the only place in the standard that risk-based thinking is a requirement?
It is not. The standard also requires us to manage risk at the process level. We've been talking a lot about organizational level stuff so far, but Clause 4.4 requires us to address risks and opportunities at the process level. We'll talk about that more later.
That's probably where we'll regularly get into the metrics and KPIs since you're doing a process.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's move on to management. What roles do leadership and management play in the successful adoption of risk-based thinking? And when you're dealing with your QMS in 9001?
Let's look at leadership first.
Okay.
So leadership and commitment requirements are also new to the 2015 edition of 9001.
Oh, that's interesting. I've not been here before 2015, so it would seem to make sense. It should have been before, but that's probably why they put it in now.
Well, there was a lot of issues that were smoothed out by this new edition.
That's great.
When I first saw it, it was still in draft, and I'm like, wow, I can use this.
That's awesome.
And just a little side note on that, you used to have in 9001, you had to have a management representative named. You had to name them by position. When they rewrote the standard, re-released it, they found that was a risk because a lot of times when auditors would show up, the MREP was the only one there. Right. And senior leadership, there was a divorce between your quality management system and your ISO system, which is
We've
bad.
talked about that before. You want those integrated.
Right. So as the requirement goes, as it pertains to our discussion here, they're required to promote the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking, as well as ensuring that the resources needed for the quality management system are available. So we're talking about risk-based thinking, but what's the end game? Mitigating risk and leveraging opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And so if leadership's going to provide resources for management to execute this, they have to own the context, the issues, and make sure your management team is completely aware of them. That can be a team effort or, leadership. If they understand this, they can just say, hey, these are the things that keep me up at night.
Yeah.
And so we're going to focus on
It's important to make sure, not from a fear perspective, but that your team knows what the risks are.
Right.
Just for the awareness of it, to keep that in mind when you're doing something, whether you're doing processes or whatever.
I've worked with teams as a consultant that I interviewed, the president, CEO, got down to it with what keeps her up at night. And when I interviewed the management team, they had no idea.
And there's a disconnect there that you really can't have. Leadership has to communicate that stuff down.
Right.
So are there any real world examples? You sort of were talking a little bit about the CEO knowing things that the other people didn't know and should have. But do you have any real world examples of how companies successfully implemented risk-based thinking under 9001?
Sure. I'll just use us here at Core. So several years ago, I took over the manager. I was the manager of consulting at the time. And I asked Scott Dawson, our president, to identify the biggest concern for the consulting process, his biggest concern, what keeps them up at night, right?
Right.
He thought about it for a couple of minutes, kind of threw him a curveball. But then right away, he came up with it, the utilization of our resources. So the consultant utilization was the issue that concerned him the most. So I got to work identifying data that could be tracked to ensure visibility of each consultant's capacity.
All right.
This gave Scott the visibility to ensure that the consultants were not being underused or overutilized.
Right. So you don't want somebody sitting at home going, oh my goodness, there's no work. What's going on? And the other one can't breathe.
Right. Exactly. It gave them another metric to indicate that what action was needed.
Okay.
That's really critical. So
right.
In this case, the action would be hiring another consultant if everybody was, the capacity was maxed out, or providing resources for training to widen the scope of the existing crew.
Right. So let's say somebody only knows 9001 and they're okay. They've got a fair amount of work, but they could take on a little more capacity, get them trained in another standard or something like that.
Right. If everybody was maxed out, then it's time to hire.
Right.
If some of the crew's maxed out, you do a little root cause and find out why. Well, they're the only ones that can do this discipline.
Right.
All right, well, we're going to cross-train some other people to distribute that. It was really my first example that I was deeply involved in that I saw this part of the standard work.
Yeah, yeah. And our listeners can apply that in some manner, how you're going to break it down and look at your risks, see how you can mitigate it. All right. So we talked about how you can apply risk-based thinking through that example. What are some ways that organizations can discover the actions they need to take to mitigate their risks or leverage their opportunities?
All right. Well, now we've defined the issues, right? Now it's critical to have some way of monitoring, measuring, analyzing, or evaluating the level that the risk is being realized or whether we're missing any opportunities.
Okay.
So real careful about that monitoring, measuring, analyzing. That's down in section 9. That's another requirement. Starting to see a theme here.
Yep.
Risk is woven all the way through the new standard.
Yep.
So the results of that analysis drives our actions.
Correct.
Right. It's also how we determine the success of our actions, right? By monitoring, we take an action, we reevaluate it. And was that the right action? Was that the wrong action?
Exactly.
Or somewhere in between. As anyone who works with me will tell you, I'm very data driven.
Yep.
We've all made decisions about the squeaky wheel or acted on emotions, and generally it doesn't go well. It doesn't end well.
You got a friend that's like, hey, your buddy, I could use some resources down here. And the person over here that shows in your metrics that they need a little help or they have the more risks. You got to pay attention to it that way.
Yeah, and probably more often it's that squeaky wheel. This issue is loud, it's in our face, and so we go after it. And then we do a lot of work to find out that it wasn't costing us but pennies. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, over here, we have a quiet problem that was costing us big.
Yeah.
And that's why this definition and ranking them with a system is really critical, because everybody out there that's listening, that's run a program has run into this.
Right.
Yeah, we were looking over here and the real problem was over there.
Yeah, and I think also something that we really didn't touch on, but I'll just mention lightly, is just because it's a risk doesn't mean you have to take mitigation actions. You may accept it. So that's another aspect that is really interesting with the standard, where it's not like you have to handle it. If you look at something and the likelihood of it happening, or it's just something we're not going to worry about right now because we have some other fish to fry, you can choose not to take any action on it, which is an action in and of itself.
That's exactly right. We're going to get into that a little bit more in a second. In this, but what you just said there is something I drive home. The decision to not take action is an action.
Yep.
Because
I learned something from it.
Yeah. So our metrics that we're watching, or the evaluations, this doesn't have to always be quantifiable objectives. It can be other ways. But if we see that it's at an acceptable level, an educated decision can be made and documented to not take action at this time. And that satisfies that part of the standard, because it says you have to take, like if one of your metrics is way off, you have to take action. If you don't, you're going to get written up for it. But deciding not to take action with details that's documented counts.
Right. So examples could be, let's say, scrap. You only have one person that can get you the raw material that you need. And it's not the best. And it's causing a lot of scrap because you have to rework things. You don't have another option. So you got to accept that risk because there's not another supplier in the world.
For now. Yep.
Now you want to stay on top of it. That doesn't mean you run away and never look at it again. Just right now, we're going to have to accept that risk because there's no other options.
Right.
Something like that would be, but you're making that choice and you did it based on data.
Yeah. And it varies from industry to industry or service to service. It's like something that we might accept as a risk because we don't have any control over it might drive the next place nuts. Like, why aren't you attacking that?
Yeah.
We don't have any control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Absolutely.
but all that's documented in your management review.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of great info for today. We're going to stop here. Next week, we're actually going to talk about those metrics, those KPIs, and how to analyze them and looking at it from the risk-based thinking perspective. Really appreciate you being here today.
Glad to be here.
We want to thank everyone who's listened to our podcast today. We hope it's been informative for you. Now, if you're looking for more information about Core Business Solutions and how we can help you with ISO certification, maybe some risk-based thinking things, cybersecurity, or even customized training, please email us at info@thecoresolution.com. You can also visit our website at www.thecoresolution.com. And if you haven't already followed us on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube, please be sure to do so. That way you won't miss the next Quality Hub podcast when it's released next week. Have a great day, everyone.